Tonight, we explore something that might seem dark at first glance: medieval punishments and the justice system. But understanding how medieval societies dealt with crime reveals fascinating insights about their values, fears, and social structures. From trial by ordeal to the stocks in the village square, medieval justice was complex, sometimes brutal, yet governed by rules and customs that made sense to the people of that time. So settle in comfortably, and let's journey through the medieval world of law, crime, and punishment. Medieval justice wasn't arbitrary chaos. Despite what Hollywood might suggest, it was a structured system, albeit very different from modern courts. Medieval people believed deeply in law, order, and punishment fitting the crime. Their methods seem harsh to us, but they reflected medieval understanding of crime, society, and human nature. Understanding medieval punishment helps us understand medieval society itself. What behaviors were criminalized tells us what communities valued. How punishments were administered shows us about social hierarchy and power. The evolution from private revenge to public justice marks a crucial development in European civilization. These weren't just abstract legal theories, but real systems that affected real people's lives. A thief caught stealing bread faced specific, predictable consequences. A murderer knew what awaited him. A village knew that justice, however harsh, would be done. This provided social order in a world that often seemed chaotic and dangerous. Tonight, we'll explore this system not with sensationalism, but with understanding. We'll see medieval justice as medieval people saw it: necessary, structured, and deeply connected to their worldview about order, morality, and community. Medieval courts came in different types, each handling specific kinds of cases. Understanding this hierarchy is essential to grasping medieval justice. At the lowest level were manorial courts, held by lords for their tenants and serfs. These courts met regularly, perhaps monthly, handling minor disputes, property boundaries, petty thefts, debt collection, and breaches of manorial custom. The lord or his steward presided, with a jury of fellow tenants judging cases. Manorial courts couldn't impose death sentences, but handled most routine legal matters. They enforced agricultural regulations, resolved disputes between neighbors, and maintained social order. These courts were accessible to ordinary people and handled the vast majority of medieval legal cases. Above manorial courts were royal courts, eventually developing into more formal structures. County courts met regularly, handling more serious crimes and appeals from manorial courts. Royal justices traveled circuits, holding assizes where major crimes like murder, rape, and grand larceny were tried. These traveling justices brought royal law to the regions. Church courts formed a parallel system, handling matters involving clergy and issues like marriage, wills, and moral offenses. Church courts used different procedures and couldn't impose death sentences, instead using excommunication, penance, and occasionally imprisonment. Clergy accused of crimes could claim benefit of clergy, being tried in church courts where punishments were typically lighter. The jury system developed during the medieval period, though it worked differently than modern juries. Early medieval juries were witnesses who knew the facts of the case personally. They testified to what they knew rather than weighing evidence presented by others. Gradually, juries evolved into judges of fact, listening to testimony and reaching verdicts. Procedures varied by court type and period, but certain elements were common. Accusations had to be formal and specific. The accused was brought before the court. Evidence was presented, though rules of evidence were less developed than today. Witnesses testified under oath. The jury or judge reached a verdict. Sentence was pronounced and carried out relatively quickly. Legal representation existed, but wasn't universal. Wealthy defendants might hire lawyers or have friends speak for them. Poor defendants often represented themselves, though sometimes community members would vouch for their character. The concept of presumed innocence didn't exist. Accusation itself carried weight. Proof was challenging. Without modern forensics, establishing guilt relied on witnesses, confessions, and reputation. A person known to be honest and law-abiding might be believed over someone with a criminal history. Communities were close-knit, so people's reputations were well known. Compurgation allowed accused persons to swear oaths of innocence, supported by oath helpers who swore to the person's truthfulness. The number of oath helpers required varied by crime severity and the accused's social status. This system assumed that perjurers feared divine punishment for false oaths. Written records became increasingly important as the medieval period progressed. Court rolls documented proceedings, verdicts, and sentences. These records, where they survive, provide historians with detailed information about medieval crime and justice. They show that medieval courts took their duties seriously and followed established procedures. Medieval societies recognized various types of crime, categorized differently than modern classifications, but no less systematic in their approach. Theft was the most common crime. This ranged from stealing small items to grand larceny involving valuable goods. The distinction mattered because punishments varied by theft amount. Stealing bread might result in fines or time in the stocks. Stealing a horse, an extremely valuable animal, could mean hanging. Repeat offenders faced harsher penalties. Theft wasn't always straightforward. Taking wood from a lord's forest might be crime or accepted custom, depending on local tradition. Gleaning leftover grain after harvest was typically allowed, but taking grain before harvest was clear theft. Communities understood these distinctions, though outsiders might not. Violence crimes included assault, murder, and rape. Murder was obviously serious, typically punished by death. But medieval law distinguished between types of killing. Accidental death might result in fines and penance rather than execution. Killing in self-defense could be pardoned. Hot-blooded killings in sudden quarrels were treated differently than premeditated murder. Assault ranged from minor scuffles to serious attacks. A punch thrown in anger might result in a fine. Attacks with weapons, or resulting in serious injury, faced harsher punishment. The victim's social status mattered. Attacking a noble was worse than fighting a fellow commoner. Rape was recognized as a serious crime, though prosecution was complicated by medieval attitudes toward women and sexuality. Married women who were raped might find their accusations dismissed if pregnancy resulted, under the belief that conception proved consent. Despite these troubling aspects, rape was prosecuted and could be punished by death or castration. Property crimes beyond simple theft included arson, which was taken extremely seriously. In societies where most buildings were wooden and fires could destroy entire villages, arson endangered the whole community. Arsonists faced harsh punishments, sometimes being burned alive in reflection of their crime. Poaching took game from forests and lands where hunting rights belonged to lords and kings. Poor people poaching to feed their families might face lenient treatment for first offenses, but harsher punishment for repeated violations. Poaching wasn't just theft, but challenge to aristocratic privilege. Treason was the ultimate crime, rebellion against lawful authority. This might mean plotting against the king, betraying one's lord, or counterfeiting royal coinage. Treason punishments were intentionally severe and theatrical, designed to deter others from similar crimes. Economic crimes included fraud, using false weights and measures, selling spoiled food, and breaking trade guild regulations. These offenses might seem minor, but were taken seriously because they undermined trust in commerce. Dishonest bakers, brewers, or merchants faced fines, closure of their businesses, or public shaming. Moral offenses fell partly under church court jurisdiction. Adultery, fornication, blasphemy, and working on Sundays were prosecutable offenses, though enforcement varied. Church courts typically imposed penances rather than physical punishments. Repeated moral offenses might result in excommunication, which had serious social consequences. Vagrancy and begging were increasingly criminalized as the medieval period progressed. Able-bodied people without employment were expected to work. Those who wandered without purpose were viewed with suspicion as potential criminals. This reflected fear of outsiders and breakdown of feudal social structures. Some behaviors we'd consider criminal weren't medieval crimes. Domestic violence, particularly husbands hitting wives, was generally legal within limits. Child labor was normal. Many workplace conditions we'd consider negligent or criminal were simply accepted as normal. Conversely, some medieval crimes seem strange today. Scolding being an argumentative woman who disturbed the peace with constant complaints was prosecutable. Being a night walker, out after curfew without good reason, could be criminal. Wearing clothing above your social station might violate sumptuary laws. The concept of victimless crimes barely existed. Medieval law focused on maintaining social order and moral behavior. Individual freedom to behave as one wished provided no one else was directly harmed, wasn't recognized as a right. Community standards and traditional behavior were enforced legally. Trial by ordeal was a distinctive medieval legal practice that seems bizarre to modern minds, but made perfect sense within medieval worldview. The fundamental logic was that God would intervene to protect the innocent and reveal the guilty. Since humans couldn't always determine truth, divine judgment would make guilt or innocence clear. This wasn't seen as superstition, but as practical theology applied to justice. Trial by hot iron required the accused to carry a hot iron bar, typically for 9 feet. The hand was then bandaged. After 3 days, the bandages were removed in church. If the wound was healing cleanly, the person was innocent. If it showed infection or signs of corruption, guilt was proven. The accused had those 3 days to pray and seek divine favor. Trial by hot water involved plunging one's hand or arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Like trial by hot iron, the wound was bandaged and examined after 3 days. Depth of immersion varied by crime severity. Minor crimes required retrieving the stone at wrist depth, major crimes at elbow depth. Trial by cold water involved being bound and lowered into blessed water. Pure water would reject the guilty, causing them to float. The innocent would sink and be quickly pulled out. This ordeal was particularly used for witchcraft accusations in later medieval period, leading to the tragic situation where floating proved guilt and sinking proved innocence, but might result in drowning. Trial by combat allowed disputants to fight, with God presumably granting victory to the party in the right. This ordeal was more common for property disputes and matters of honor than for criminal cases. The combatants might fight personally or hire champions to fight for them. Women, clergy, children, and the infirm could use champions. The fight continued until one party yielded, was killed, or the sun set. Trial by ordeal wasn't used for every case, only when other evidence was lacking or inconclusive. It was a last resort when witnesses, oaths, and confession couldn't establish truth. Many cases never reached ordeal stage, being resolved through other means. Preparations for ordeal were elaborate. The accused fasted and attended. Priests blessed the water or iron. The ordeal took place in church or churchyard under clerical supervision. Prayer accompanied each step. This religious context emphasized that human judgment had reached its limits and divine intervention was being sought. Critics existed even in medieval times. Some churchmen questioned whether forcing God to perform miracles was appropriate. Some suspected that outcomes could be manipulated. A sympathetic priest might allow the iron to cool more than supposed, or a hostile one might ensure it was truly burning hot. By the early 13th century, the Catholic Church officially withdrew support for trial by ordeal. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. This effectively ended the practice in most of Europe, as ordeals without clerical blessing lost their theological justification. The end of trial by ordeal forced development of other legal proof methods. Jury trials expanded to fill the gap. Greater emphasis was placed on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. In some ways, ending trial by ordeal pushed medieval justice toward more rational methods. Yet we shouldn't dismiss ordeal as pure superstition. It served social functions. The drama and solemnity surrounding ordeals reinforced social norms. The accused had time between ordeal and judgment to confess if guilty, and many did. The community's belief in divine judgment made verdicts more acceptable. When examination showed a healing wound, the accused was cleared not just by human judgment, but by God, eliminating doubt. Some scholars suggest psychological factors influenced outcomes. A truly innocent person might approach the ordeal with confidence and calm, while guilt might cause stress, affecting the body's healing. Whether this actually occurred is debatable, but it shows how ordeals might not have been as arbitrary as they seem. Trial by ordeal existed in other cultures beyond medieval Europe. Various societies have used similar practices, suggesting something universal in the desire to invoke higher powers for difficult judgments. Medieval Europeans weren't uniquely irrational in this regard, but were following human patterns seen across history and cultures. The stocks and pillory were ubiquitous features of medieval towns and villages, serving multiple purposes in the justice system. Let's explore these common punishments in detail. The stocks held ankles, forcing the offender to sit. The pillory held head and hands, forcing the offender to stand. Both were wooden devices with holes through which the offender's limbs were locked. They stood in prominent public places, usually the market square or churchyard, ensuring maximum visibility. Time in stocks or pillory was punishment for minor offenses: petty theft, drunkenness, fighting, dishonest trading, blasphemy, or disturbing the peace. Sentences typically lasted hours rather than days, perhaps 3 hours to a full day. Repeat offenders might receive longer sentences. The punishment combined several elements. There was physical discomfort from the awkward position and inability to move. There was exposure to weather, with offenders left in stocks during rain, heat, or cold. There was vulnerability to whatever the public chose to do. But primarily, the punishment was shame. Public humiliation was the point. Everyone passing by could see who was being punished and why. The offense might be written on a sign or announced by officials. The offender's face was visible, identity known to all. In small communities where everyone knew everyone, this shame was profound and lasting. The public could add to the punishment, throwing rotten vegetables, mud, dead animals, or worse at the offender was common and often encouraged. People might mock, insult, and berate the offender. This wasn't official punishment, but wasn't prevented either. Community disapproval was expressed through these actions. However, the crowd's reaction wasn't always hostile. If the offense was minor, or the offender was generally liked, people might be sympathetic. They might offer water or shade on hot days. They might throw less harmful items or refrain from throwing anything. The community's judgment was thus expressed through their treatment of the offender. Some offenders were more vulnerable than others. Women in the stocks faced additional humiliations. Their position made them targets for sexual harassment. This wasn't officially sanctioned, but was common enough to be a known aspect of the punishment. Elderly or sick offenders might genuinely suffer from the physical strain. Dishonest traders received special treatment. A baker who sold underweight bread might be put in the stocks with his false bread tied around his neck. A brewster who sold weak ale might have her product poured over her head. These punishments made the offense visible and served as warnings to other traders. cucking stool or ducking stool was a variant used primarily for women accused of being scolds, gossips, or shrews. The offender was strapped to a chair on a lever arm and dunked in water, sometimes repeatedly. This combined public humiliation with physical unpleasantness. The gendered nature of this punishment reflected medieval attitudes toward women who were considered too talkative or argumentative. Release from stocks or pillory usually involved further ritual. Officials would unlock the device and make a pronouncement about the completed punishment. The offender might be warned about future behavior. Then they would return home, having paid their debt to society, but bearing the shame of public punishment. The psychological impact could be lasting. The memory of standing helplessly in the pillory while neighbors watched and judged would be powerful deterrent against repeating the offense. For some, the shame might be crushing. For others, it might breed resentment rather than remorse. Stocks and pillory were economic punishments in the sense that they were cheap to administer. No imprisonment costs, no guards needed, no execution expenses. The community handled the punishment through their participation. This made it practical for minor offenses that needed addressing, but didn't warrant severe punishment. These devices remained common through the medieval period and beyond, lasting in some places into the 19th century. Their long persistence suggests they were considered effective. They balanced punishment with practicality, shame with community involvement, deterrence with economy. From a modern perspective, stocks and pillory seem degrading and cruel, violations of human dignity, but medieval people saw them differently. Crime violated community standards. Public punishment reaffirmed those standards. The offender's shame was considered just consequence of wrong behavior, and the punishment ended. The person returned to normal life afterward. Unlike execution or mutilation, monetary penalties were actually the most common medieval punishments, more frequent than physical punishments, but less dramatic, and thus less remembered in popular imagination. Fines could be imposed for virtually any offense. Minor thefts might incur fines equal to several times the stolen item's value. Assault might bring fines based on injury severity. Economic offenses like fraud or false measures typically resulted in fines. Even some serious crimes might be settled with sufficiently large fines if the victim's family agreed. The amount varied based on multiple factors. The offense's severity was primary, but the offender's social status mattered too. Wealthy individuals paid higher fines for the same offense than poor people, partially because they could afford more and partially because fines needed to hurt enough to be effective punishment. Victims' status also mattered. Injuring a nobleman cost more than injuring a peasant. This wasn't considered unjust, but rather recognition of social hierarchy. A noble's worth was literally considered greater than a commoner's. This economic valuation of human worth seems disturbing today, but was fundamental to medieval thinking. Payment schedules could be negotiated. Someone unable to pay a large fine immediately might arrange installment payments. Sometimes property could be seized to satisfy fines. In extremis, people unable to pay might be imprisoned until payment was made, essentially debtor's prison. Wergild was a specific type of compensation, literally man price, paid for killing someone. This was calculated based on the victim's social status. A king's wergild was enormous. A noble's was substantial. A freeman's was moderate. A serf's was minimal. Paying wergild satisfied the debt to the victim's family and avoided blood feud. Wergild served an important social function. It provided alternative to endless revenge cycles. When someone was killed, their family wanted justice, which traditionally meant killing the murderer. But if the murderer's family then killed someone in revenge, the cycle continued. Wergild broke this cycle by providing compensation that satisfied honor while ending violence. Not all families accepted wergild. Some insisted on blood revenge, particularly in cases of murder. But social pressure and legal framework encouraged accepting compensation. A family that refused reasonable wergild and insisted on revenge might be seen as unreasonable. Courts preferred settlements to ongoing feuds. Property damage required compensation. If you burned someone's barn, you paid for it. If your animals damaged someone's crops, you compensated them. If you broke someone's tools, you replaced them. This was direct restitution, making the victim whole rather than abstract punishment. The concept of victim compensation was actually more developed in medieval law than in much of modern law. where criminal punishment often does nothing to help victims. Medieval justice focused on making victims whole through compensation. The community's interest was satisfied through shame and deterrence, but the victim received actual recompense. Inability to pay fines created problems. Poor people who couldn't pay might face physical punishment instead. This created a two-tier system where wealthy people could buy their way out of consequences, while poor people suffered corporal punishment. This inequality was recognized, but accepted as inevitable given different social stations. Collection of fines involved various officials. Manorial courts might have reeves or bailiffs who collected payments. Royal courts used sheriffs and their subordinates. Fines went to different destinations depending on the court and offense. Some went to victims as compensation. Some went to lords or crown as punishment payments. The distinction mattered in terms of who benefited. Tax evasion was treated seriously, as it directly affected royal revenue. Fines for tax evasion could be substantial, possibly including seizure of property. Tax collectors had significant power to investigate and assess penalties. Disputes over taxes could be contentious, with accusations of both tax evasion by subjects and illegal tax demands by collectors. Commercial regulations were enforced through fines. Guild members who violated guild rules paid fines to the guild. Merchants who cheated customers paid fines to town authorities. These economic penalties regulated business behavior without requiring physical punishment. The fine system incentivized reporting crimes, as informants might receive portions of fines collected. This created a culture of reporting and enforcement, but also encouraged false accusations motivated by profit. Courts had to balance encouraging reports with preventing malicious accusations. Some wealthy individuals could essentially buy freedom to commit certain offenses through regular fine payments. Royal licenses might be purchased, allowing activities that would otherwise be illegal. This wasn't seen as corruption, but as pragmatic revenue generation by authorities and pragmatic business strategy by those buying licenses. The prevalence of monetary penalties reflected medieval society's nature. Most people had some property or goods that could be taken as payment. Money as such wasn't always necessary. Payment in kind was acceptable. The system was flexible enough to function in an economy not fully monetized. From a modern rehabilitation perspective, fines don't address underlying criminal behavior. But medieval justice didn't emphasize rehabilitation as we understand it. The goal was punishment as retribution, deterrence of others, and compensation to victims. Fines achieved all three goals efficiently and economically. Medieval justice sometimes marked offenders permanently, ensuring their crimes were publicly visible. These punishments were serious, reserved for significant offenses or repeat criminals, and changed the offender's life forever. Branding involved using heated metal to burn a mark into the offender's skin, typically on the face, hand, or arm, where it would be visible. The mark indicated the crime. T for thief, M for murderer, F for false witness, or other letters depending on the offense. This permanent mark warned others about the person's criminal past. The procedure was brutal but quick. The branded metal was heated until red hot. The offender was restrained. The brand was pressed firmly against skin for several seconds, leaving a deep burn. The pain was intense. The wound would eventually heal into a permanent scar, forming the letter or symbol. Branding served multiple purposes. It punished through pain and marked the offender for life. It protected community by making criminals identifiable. It deterred others who feared permanent disfigurement. It eliminated any chance the convicted person could start fresh elsewhere, unknown. For branded individuals, life became significantly harder. Everyone who saw the brand knew they were criminals. This made finding work difficult. Social relationships were affected. Marriage prospects for young branded individuals were severely limited. Some branded people left their home areas, seeking places where they weren't known, though the brand followed them. Some brands could be concealed with clothing or hair, giving the offender some control over visibility. Brands on foreheads or cheeks were impossible to hide, except with veils or masks. Hand brands could be hidden in pockets or gloves. This created distinctions between those who could move through society somewhat normally and those whose crimes were always visible. Mutilation removed body parts as punishment, typically hands, ears, noses, or eyes. The specific mutilation often related to the crime. Thieves might lose hands used in stealing. False witnesses might lose the tongue used for lying. Counterfeiters might lose hands used to make false coins. This concept of matching punishment to crime had ancient precedent. Ear cropping was relatively common. The offender's ear or ears were cut off, leaving obvious disfigurement. Ear loss didn't disable the person significantly, but marked them visibly. The punishment was painful, but not life-threatening if done competently and infection avoided. Nose slitting or removal disfigured victims severely. The nose is prominent, and its loss creates obvious deformity. This punishment was sometimes used for sexual offenses, particularly adultery. The connection between nose and genitals in some cultural beliefs made nose removal symbolically appropriate for sexual crimes. Hand removal disabled as well as marked the offender. Losing a hand made many kinds of work impossible or difficult. This effectively punished not just through pain and disfigurement, but by limiting future options. A one-handed person faced significant challenges in medieval society, where most work was manual. Blinding, removing, or destroying eyes was a severe punishment used occasionally for the worst offenses or traitors. A blind person was utterly dependent on others for survival. This punishment effectively ended the person's ability to function independently. It was used when authorities wanted the offender permanently incapacitated but alive. Castration was sometimes used for rape or sexual offenses. This punished through pain, marked the offender, and removed the ability to commit similar crimes again. It was practiced, but not extremely common, perhaps because of religious opposition or concern about the victim's survival. These mutilations were performed by executioners or other officials, not by trained medical personnel. The procedures were crude, infection was common, and some victims died from complications. Surviving meant enduring pain, dealing with wounds, and living with permanent disability. The psychological trauma of mutilation was substantial. Beyond physical pain and loss of function, victims faced social stigma. Their disfigurement marked them as criminals forever. This could lead to despair, bitterness, or determination to live within the law, since further offenses might bring execution. Repeat offenders faced escalating mutilations, First offense might bring branding. Second offense might cost an ear. Third offense might mean hand removal or death. This escalation was designed to give offenders chances to reform, while imposing increasingly severe consequences for continued criminal behavior. Some mutilations were reversible to a degree. Branding might be obscured by deliberate scarring. Nose stumps could be partially reconstructed. Ear loss could be hidden by hair. Medieval people showed some ingenuity in dealing with these punishments' effects. But nothing could fully remove the mark or restore lost function. Churches and religious orders sometimes provided charity to mutilated individuals unable to work. Begging was often the only option for disabled people. Some formed communities of outcasts. Others managed to find niches where their disabilities didn't prevent useful work. The decline of mutilation and branding came gradually. As imprisonment became more practical with better prison facilities, permanent disfigurement seemed less necessary. Enlightenment thinking about dignity and rehabilitation made mutilation seem barbaric. By the modern era, it had disappeared from Western legal codes. From our perspective, deliberately disfiguring people seems cruel and counterproductive. How does permanently disabling someone serve justice or help society? But medieval thinking was different. Crime deserved severe punishment. Deterrence mattered more than rehabilitation. Permanent marks protected the community. Within that framework, mutilation and branding made sense. Exile from community was serious punishment in medieval society, where belonging to a community provided safety, identity, and livelihood. Banishment meant being ordered to leave and forbidden to return for a specified period or forever. This might apply to a village, town, or even an entire kingdom. The banished person had to depart immediately or within a short grace period. Returning before the ban expired brought severe consequences, potentially execution. Lesser banishment might last a year or several years. This allowed offenders to travel elsewhere, perhaps find work, and return eventually. During the banishment, they lost property rights and social standing in their home community. Upon return, if permitted, they might resume their former life, though stigma might remain. Permanent banishment was more serious. The person could never return home. Everything they knew and everyone they knew was lost. In a world where most people lived and died near their birthplace, this was profoundly disruptive. Permanent banishment was for serious crimes that didn't quite warrant execution. Outlawry went beyond simple banishment. The outlaw was declared outside the law's protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without legal consequence. The outlaw's property was confiscated. They were forbidden shelter, food, or aid by anyone. Essentially, they were dead to society while still breathing. The process of outlawry was formal. After conviction, the person was declared outlaw in court. This declaration was publicized. A horn might be blown to symbolize the outlaw's status as wolf, hunted like a wild animal. The phrase wolfhead referred to outlaws, emphasizing their animal status outside human society. An outlaw faced terrible choices. They could flee to wilderness areas, living rough and avoiding human contact. Some outlaws formed bands, preying on travelers. Others fled to different kingdoms, where their outlaw status might not be known or enforced. Some survived in forests, becoming the basis for outlaw legends like Robin Hood. Sanctuary could protect even outlaws temporarily. If they reached a church and claimed sanctuary, they were safe from immediate violence. However, they had to either stand trial or confess and accept exile. Sanctuary provided breathing room, but not permanent solution. The outlaw's family suffered too. Their property was confiscated, affecting wives, children, and other relatives. The family faced social stigma. In some cases, they might be allowed to retain some property or means of survival, but they definitely suffered from their relatives' outlawry. Some outlaws eventually sought pardons. Royal pardons could be purchased or earned through service. A desperate king needing soldiers might offer pardons to outlaws who joined his army. Prominent outlaws might negotiate terms for return, but obtaining pardon was difficult and uncertain. Living as an outlaw was harsh. Constant vigilance against bounty hunters or casual murder was exhausting. Finding food without being able to farm or trade was difficult. Winter could be deadly. Disease and injury with no medical care often proved fatal. Few outlaws survived long. Some societies had designated places for outlaws. Iceland, for instance, had internal exile areas where outlaws could survive away from from settled regions. This allowed perpetual exile without forcing outlaws into total wilderness survival. The psychology of outlawry must have been devastating. Your entire identity was tied to community. Being declared outside that community, rejected by everyone you knew, hunted like an animal, must have been a fate in some ways worse than quick execution. The psychological torture of outlawry was part of its punishment. Communities accepted outlawry as necessary for extreme cases. Someone who committed terrible crimes, but circumstances prevented execution, might be outlawed. Someone who repeatedly violated community norms, despite lesser punishments, might be removed permanently. Outlawry protected the community by eliminating persistent threats. The drama of outlawry appealed to storytellers. Ballads and tales about outlaws became popular. Some outlaws became folk heroes, depicted as wrongly accused or rebelling against unjust authority. Robin Hood is the most famous example, though his historical reality is debatable. These stories romanticized outlaw life far beyond its brutal reality. Outlawry declined as nation-states developed better law enforcement and more organized justice systems. By late medieval period, long-term imprisonment became more practical than outlawry. Banishment continued longer, sometimes used for political enemies or as alternative to execution. Transportation to colonies became a later variation of banishment. Execution was the ultimate penalty, reserved for the most serious crimes. Medieval societies used various methods, each with specific purposes and meanings. Hanging was the most common execution method for commoners. It was relatively quick, didn't require special equipment beyond rope and a structure, and could be performed in any town or village. The condemned was led to the gallows, typically located in a prominent place. A rope was placed around the neck, and the person was pushed off a platform or cart, pulled away. Death by hanging wasn't always quick. The drop often wasn't long enough to break the neck, so death came from strangulation, which took minutes of conscious suffering. Sometimes family or friends would pull on the condemned's legs to hasten death. Executioners might perform this service for a fee. Bodies were left hanging as warnings, sometimes for days until they rotted. Beheading was considered more honorable than hanging, and and was typically reserved for nobility. A skilled executioner with a sharp axe or sword could sever the head with one blow. This was quick and relatively painless if done competently. However, unskilled executioners sometimes required multiple blows, leading to prolonged suffering. The condemned knelt and placed their head on a block. The executioner positioned himself carefully, measured the distance, and struck with full force. A good executioner was valued and paid well. A poor executioner was despised and might face violence from the crowd if they bungled the job. In some regions and periods, beheading was done with a sword rather than an axe, the executioner sweeping the blade horizontally. This required great skill, but could be cleaner than axe beheading. French and German territories particularly favored sword execution for nobility. Burning at the stake was used for heresy, witchcraft, and sometimes treason or heinous murders. The condemned was tied to a post surrounded by wood and fuel. The fire was lit. Death could come from smoke inhalation or from the flames themselves, depending on wind and fire conditions. Burning was intentionally terrible. It served as the ultimate deterrent and was theologically justified for heretics as purification. The screams, smell, and visible suffering were part of the punishment's purpose. Some executioners showed mercy by strangling victims before lighting the fire, or by arranging the fire to cause quick death. But this wasn't guaranteed. Women convicted of husband murder or petty treason were sometimes burned. This reflected the particular horror with which such crimes were viewed. The normal hierarchy said wives obeyed husbands. Murdering one's husband was not just murder, but overthrow of proper order, deserving special punishment. Drawing and quartering was the punishment for high treason against the crown. This was the most severe execution possible, involving maximum pain and humiliation. The condemned was dragged through streets on a hurdle, hanged, but cut down before death, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and finally cut into quarters. Each part of this multi-stage execution had symbolic meaning. The purpose was both punishment and deterrence. Anyone witnessing drawing and quartering would understand the consequences of treason, the body's treatment after death, being cut into pieces and displayed in multiple locations, emphasized the complete destruction of the traitor. Drowning was occasionally used, particularly for women, or for particular crimes in areas near water. The condemned might be tied and thrown into a river or lake, or sewn into a sack with animals and thrown in. Drowning was considered somewhat less dishonorable than hanging, but was still a shameful death. Burial alive was rare, but occasionally used for women convicted of murder. The condemned was placed in a pit, and earth was shoveled over them until suffocation occurred. This method was uncommon, but represented the community's horror at the crime. Breaking on the wheel was a particularly brutal method used primarily in continental Europe. The condemned was tied to a large wheel. An executioner systematically broke bones with an iron bar, working from limbs toward the torso. Death came eventually from shock and internal injuries. The wheel with the body attached might be raised on a pole for public display. This method was reserved for the worst crimes and was meant to maximize suffering. The process could take hours. It was the ultimate expression of societal vengeance, showing that some crimes deserved extreme punishment. Pressing to death was technically not execution, but rather coercion to plead. Someone refusing to enter a plea couldn't be tried. Pressing involved laying heavy stones on the person until they either pleaded or died. The logic was that refusing to plead delayed justice, so pressure was applied to force cooperation. Death under pressing technically wasn't execution for a crime, but died without conviction. Public executions served multiple purposes. They deterred crime by showing consequences. They satisfied public desire for justice. They demonstrated state power. They provided entertainment in societies with limited amusements. Crowds gathered for executions, and the atmosphere could be festive. However, crowds could be unpredictable. If they sympathized with the condemned, they might riot or try to rescue them. If they opposed lenient treatment, they might demand harsher punishment. Authorities had to manage crowds carefully to prevent disorder. Last rites and confession were typically allowed. A priest heard final confession, providing absolution. This showed mercy to the soul, if not the body. Many condemned criminals spent their last hours in prayer and preparation for afterlife. This religious aspect made execution more than just physical punishment, it was preparation for divine judgment. Some condemned used their last moments for speeches. They might proclaim innocence, confess guilt, warn others against crime, or make political statements. Authorities sometimes controlled what could be said, but dying declarations carried weight and were remembered. Bodies after execution were handled various ways. Some were given to families for burial. Others were left to rot as warnings. Some were dissected by physicians for anatomical study. Criminals' bodies were one of few sources for medical dissection, making execution serve an educational purpose. The horror of these methods is obvious to modern sensibility. They were intentionally brutal, designed to terrify and deter. But we should understand them in context. Medieval life was harsh, and death was familiar. People witnessed animal slaughter regularly. Violence was common. Public executions fit into this world in ways they don't fit into ours. Medieval prisons weren't punishment as imprisonment is today. They were holding places where people awaited trial, execution, or payment of debts. The concept of serving time as punishment developed later. Castle dungeons provided the archetypal medieval prison image: dark, damp, underground cells. These existed and housed important prisoners. But most imprisonment happened in less dramatic facilities: rooms in castles, towers in city walls, cellars, or even secured rooms in ordinary buildings. Conditions varied enormously. Noble prisoners might be held under house arrest or in comfortable rooms. They might have servants, good food, and entertainment. The goal wasn't to punish, but to hold them securely while ransom was negotiated or until political situations changed. Common criminals faced harsher conditions. Cells might be shared, cramped, dirty, poorly ventilated, and cold. Sanitation was minimal. Food was basic. Light and fresh air were limited. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Many prisoners died before facing trial or punishment. Prisoners weren't generally fed by authorities, except minimally. Families were expected to provide food. Those without family support might receive charitable provisions or simply starve. This created a system where wealthy prisoners ate well, while poor prisoners suffered hunger. Jailers were often corrupt. They charged fees for everything: better cells, less restrictive chains, food, drink, visits from family. Prisoners without money suffered more than those who could pay. Some jailers essentially extorted money from prisoners and their families. Chains and restraints were common. Prisoners might be chained to walls, kept in irons on hands and feet, or placed in stocks within the prison. This prevented escape, but caused suffering. Long-term restraint could cause permanent physical damage. The weight of chains added to discomfort and disability. Some prisons had different sections for different prisoner types. Debtors might be separated from criminals. Women might have separate areas. The wealthy might be kept apart from common prisoners. This segregation reflected social hierarchy and protected valuable prisoners from common criminal violence. Torture was practiced in some jurisdictions to extract confessions. Methods included the rack, which stretched the body, thumb screws that crushed thumbs, and strappado, which dislocated shoulders. Torture was supposed to follow rules. It couldn't cause permanent injury or death, couldn't be repeated excessively, and confessions under torture had to be confirmed freely afterward. In practice, torture was brutal and often did cause permanent injury. Victims would confess to anything to stop the pain. The legal fiction that torture revealed truth was questionable. Some jurisdictions used it extensively. Others avoided it. The church generally condemned torture, but didn't always prevent its use. Escape attempts were common. Prisoners might try to bribe guards, dig through walls, or overpower captors. Success depended on prison security, guard corruption, outside help, and luck. Recaptured escapees faced additional punishment and harsher conditions. Prison sentences as punishment existed, but were rare. Ecclesiastical imprisonment for clergy who violated church law sometimes involved long-term confinement. Some heretics were imprisoned rather than executed. Political prisoners might be held indefinitely, but these were exceptions to the general pattern of using prisons for detention only. Children born in prison to imprisoned mothers faced grim prospects. Some prisons allowed pregnant women to give birth and raise infants inside. These children lived in terrible conditions through no fault of their own. Their chances of survival were poor. Prison chaplains provided spiritual care to prisoners. They heard confessions provided last rites for those facing execution, offered counsel, and sometimes tried to improve conditions. Not all prisons had chaplains, but where they existed, they provided some comfort. Disease was rampant in medieval prisons. Typhus, called jail fever, spread easily in crowded, dirty conditions. Dysentery from contaminated water killed many. Respiratory infections flourished in damp conditions. Tuberculosis was common. Simply being imprisoned carried significant risk of illness and death. Wealthy prisoners sometimes hosted gatherings in their cells. They might play games, read, or entertain visitors. They could maintain some dignity and comfort despite imprisonment. This contrasted sharply with the misery of poor prisoners. Prison reform was not a priority. Prisons weren't supposed to be pleasant. They were holding facilities. If conditions were harsh, that wasn't considered a problem unless prisoners died before facing justice. Reform movements wouldn't begin until much later in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some prisons were essentially businesses. Private individuals might contract to run prisons, profiting from prisoner fees and exploitation. This created incentives to extract money from prisoners rather than provide humane conditions. Release from prison happened when trial occurred. Execution was carried out, debt was paid, or authorities decided to free the prisoner. There was no standard term served. People might be imprisoned for days, months, years, or die there. It depended entirely on their situation. The psychological effects of medieval imprisonment were severe. Uncertainty about fate, terrible conditions, constant fear, and social isolation caused mental anguish. Some prisoners went mad. Others became resigned to their fate. Religious faith provided comfort for some. From a modern perspective, medieval prisons were human rights disasters. But the concept of imprisonment as humane alternative to corporal or capital punishment didn't yet exist. Prisons were waypoints in the justice process, not destinations. The medieval church operated its own legal system parallel to secular courts, creating complex jurisdictional questions and providing alternatives to harsh secular justice. Church courts, called ecclesiastical courts, had jurisdiction over clergy and certain types of cases involving laypeople. Clergy accused of crimes could claim benefit of clergy, being tried in church courts rather than secular courts. This provided significant advantage, as church courts couldn't impose death penalty and generally gave lighter sentences. To claim benefit of clergy, the accused had to demonstrate clerical status. Initially, this meant proving ordination. Later, demonstrating literacy became sufficient, as clergy were expected to read Latin. Courts would hand the accused a Bible and ask them to read. If they could, even barely, they might claim benefit of clergy. This created a loophole where educated laypeople could avoid secular punishment by claiming clerical status based on literacy. Eventually, benefit of clergy was extended formally to all literate people for first offenses. This created a two-tier system where literacy provided legal advantage. Church courts handled marriage disputes, wills, cases of moral offenses, and heresy. Marriage law was church jurisdiction. Questions of legitimate marriage, annulment, and inheritance connected to marriage fell to church courts. This gave the church enormous social power. Punishments in church courts differed from secular courts. Excommunication, being cut off from church sacraments, was the severest church punishment. This had serious consequences. Excommunicated individuals couldn't receive communion, be buried in consecrated ground, or participate in church life. In deeply religious societies, this was devastating. Penance was common church court punishment. The guilty party had to perform specified religious acts, prayers, fasts, pilgrimages, or charity work. Public penance might require standing outside church in rough clothing, confessing sin before the congregation. This imposed spiritual and social costs without physical harm. Some church prisons existed for clergy who committed serious offenses. These were generally less harsh than secular prisons. Monasteries sometimes served as prisons for errant clergy who would live under strict monastic rule as punishment. Sanctuary was an ancient church principle. Someone fleeing justice could enter a church and claim sanctuary, becoming immune from arrest. Authorities couldn't drag people from churches without committing sacrilege. This provided temporary protection for accused criminals. Rules governed sanctuary. The fugitive had to stay inside church boundaries. They could remain up to 40 days. During this time, they could choose, stand trial, or confess guilt and accept exile from the kingdom. If they chose exile, they would be escorted to the coast and expelled. Some criminals abused sanctuary, hiding in churches for weeks or months. Communities found this frustrating. Guards would be posted to ensure the fugitive didn't escape or leave sanctuary and resume criminal activity. It was a standoff where neither church nor secular authority wanted to back down. Sanctuary violations did occur. Particularly angry or powerful people sometimes dragged fugitives from churches. This created conflicts between church and state. Bishops might threaten excommunication for sanctuary violation. Kings might punish those who respected sanctuary over royal justice. The church's role in justice reflected medieval society's religious nature. Spiritual consequences mattered. Church courts served as checks on secular power. The availability of church justice and sanctuary meant accused people had some options beyond secular courts. Conflicts between church and secular courts were common. Who had jurisdiction over particular cases could be disputed. Clergy committing serious crimes might face both church and secular prosecution. These jurisdictional battles shaped medieval politics and the development of legal systems. Reform movements eventually limited church court scope. Benefit of clergy was restricted. Sanctuary was limited or eliminated. Church court jurisdiction shrank to purely ecclesiastical matters. This process took centuries and involved political struggles between church and emerging nation-states. Medieval justice was explicitly tied to social status. How you were treated by the legal system depended heavily on whether you were noble, free commoner, or serf. Nobles faced different legal procedures than commoners. They could demand trial by peers, being judged by other nobles rather than by mixed juries. They could not be subjected to certain degrading punishments like hanging or the stocks. If executed, they received beheading, considered more honorable. This differential treatment reflected medieval social theory. Nobles were literally believed to be better than commoners, different in essence. Their blood was considered noble, giving them special qualities. Law reflected this supposed natural hierarchy. Nobles accused of crimes might not face trial at all if sufficiently powerful. Political considerations sometimes trumped law. A nobleman with armed followers and allies might be too dangerous to prosecute. Justice was negotiated or ignored rather than enforced. Conversely, nobles had fewer excuses for bad behavior. They were expected to embody higher standards. A nobleman who stole faced more shame than a starving commoner who stole. The nobility's supposed virtue made their crimes more serious betrayals of their status. Free commoners had access to courts and legal protections, but faced harsher punishments than nobles. They could be hanged, placed in stocks, branded, or mutilated. Their lives and bodies weren't as valued as nobles' lives and bodies. Serfs had even fewer rights. They couldn't leave their lord's land without permission. Conflicts between serfs were often handled by manorial courts without external appeal. Serfs couldn't bring cases against their lords in many jurisdictions. They were in some ways property of their lords. Women's legal status was complicated. They could bring certain cases to court. They could testify in some situations, but their legal capacity was limited by gender and marital status. Married women, particularly, had restricted legal independence, being represented by husbands in most legal matters. Crimes against upper-class victims were punished more severely than identical crimes against lower-class victims. Stealing from a noble meant harsher punishment than stealing from a commoner. Injuring a nobleman cost more in fines than injuring a peasant. The legal system explicitly valued people differently. This seems grossly unjust by modern standards, but medieval people generally accepted it as proper. Social hierarchy was divinely ordained. Different people had different worth and different rights. Treating everyone equally would have seemed as strange as treating children and adults identically. Some proto-democratic elements existed. Jury service was drawn from communities. Local courts handled many cases based on community standards. But these elements functioned within accepted hierarchy. Juries of commoners judged other commoners, not nobles. Bribery and corruption affected justice. Wealthy people could afford better legal representation. They could pay bribes to judges or jailers. They could hire false witnesses. Poor people couldn't access these options and faced justice with few resources. The church provided some counterweight to and class-based justice. Before God, all souls were equal. Church courts sometimes treated rich and poor more similarly than secular courts did. Sanctuary protected criminals of any class. These elements provided limited checks on pure class privilege. As medieval period progressed, some movement toward more equal justice occurred. Royal law courts, while not perfectly egalitarian, applied law more consistently than local courts. Centralized legal systems reduced arbitrary local justice. But full legal equality was still centuries away. Understanding medieval class-based justice is essential to understanding the whole system. It wasn't a bug, but a feature. Modern ideas about equal justice under law were foreign to medieval thinking. Justice reflected and reinforced social hierarchy. Medieval justice evolved throughout the period, gradually changing toward systems we'd recognize as more modern. Understanding this evolution shows how current legal ideas developed. Early medieval justice relied heavily on local custom and personal relationships. Law wasn't written or standardized. Different communities had different practices. Justice was personal. Victims confronted wrongdoers. Communities decided outcomes. Feuds settled disputes. The gradual centralization of royal power changed this. Kings claimed ultimate authority over justice. Royal courts supplemented and eventually superseded local courts for serious crimes. Written law began replacing purely customary law. Legal records were kept. These changes made justice more standardized and predictable. Professional lawyers emerged. Initially, everyone represented themselves or had friends speak for them. But as law became more complex and standardized, specialized legal knowledge became valuable. Law schools developed. Legal profession became distinct. This professionalization increased legal sophistication, but also increased costs. Trial by ordeal's end forced development of alternative proof methods. Circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and documentary evidence became more important. Rules of evidence developed. The jury's role evolved from personal knowledge to weighing presented evidence. These changes moved toward more rational legal proceedings. The concept of intent gradually became more important. Early medieval law focused mainly on actions and outcomes. Later medieval law increasingly considered whether crimes were intentional, accidental, or committed in passion. This sophistication recognized complexity of human behavior and motivation. Punishment slowly shifted from purely retributive to including deterrent and eventually rehabilitative elements. While medieval justice remained primarily retributive, some thinkers began questioning whether punishment should aim at reform rather than just revenge. Torture's decline began in late medieval period, though it persisted into early modern era. Doubts about torture's reliability and ethical concerns led to restrictions. Eventually, torture was banned in most European jurisdictions, though this process took centuries. Benefit of clergy's expansion made more people eligible for lighter church court treatment. This created pressure for reform as the two-tier system became harder to defend. Eventually, benefit of clergy was abolished, and single legal standards applied regardless of literacy. Public executions' nature changed. While still public, executions became more controlled and less carnival-like. The message shifted from community vengeance to state power. This reflected growing state centralization and changing ideas about public order. Imprisonment gradually became punishment rather than just pre-trial detention. This profound shift reflected changing ideas about punishment's purpose. If the goal was reform, imprisonment allowing reflection might achieve it better than corporal punishment. Women's legal status slowly improved. They gained more ability to bring cases, own property, and act independently. This process was very gradual and uneven, but movement was toward greater legal recognition of women as full persons. The idea of presumption of innocence began developing. Medieval law generally presumed accusation indicated guilt. The burden of proof was on the accused to demonstrate innocence. The reversal, requiring prosecution to prove guilt, was revolutionary and took time to establish. Legal representation became recognized as important right rather than luxury. Poor defendants deserved representation too. This principle wasn't fully realized in medieval period, but began being articulated by legal thinkers. These changes didn't happen smoothly or universally. Different regions and jurisdictions evolved at different rates. But overall trajectory was toward more systematic, rational, and eventually more humane justice systems. The transition from medieval to modern justice took centuries. Many medieval elements persisted into early modern period and beyond. But the foundations of modern Western legal systems were laid in medieval developments. Understanding this evolution helps us appreciate both how far legal systems have come and how current systems retain echoes of medieval practices. The jury trial, presumption of innocence, legal representation, and other features we take for granted developed gradually from medieval foundations. As we conclude our journey through medieval punishments and justice, several insights emerge. Medieval justice was brutal by our standards, yet it was systematic and purposeful within its own context. It reflected medieval values, fears, and understanding of crime and punishment. The systems we've explored weren't arbitrary cruelty, but structured responses to maintaining order in societies. Lacking modern law enforcement, prisons, or forensic science, medieval people did the best they could with available tools and knowledge. Their methods served their needs, however harsh those methods seem to us. Understanding medieval justice helps us appreciate how far legal systems have evolved. Rights we take for granted, presumption of innocence, fair trial, humane punishment, were hard-won over centuries. Each advance came from questioning inherited practices and imagining better alternatives. Yet medieval justice also reminds us that future generations will likely view some current practices with similar horror. Our systems aren't perfect. We're still evolving. The medieval to modern transition isn't complete, but ongoing. The human constant through all these changes is the desire for justice, for order, for communities where people feel safe and wrongs are addressed. Medieval people wanted these things. We want them. The methods change, but the core need remains. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can reflect on how societies create justice systems reflecting their values and capabilities. Medieval punishments told stories about medieval life, its dangers, hierarchies, beliefs, and constant negotiation between individual and community needs. Sleep well, knowing that while the past was harsh in many ways, it has also given us the foundations to build something better. Thank you for joining this exploration. Good night.